I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting on President Obama's trip to Saudi Arabia at the end of this week. The relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia are going through a difficult period, more difficult than any time before. Thank you. The Saudis are unhappy and basically suspicious of the Iran-US talks. They don't trust the Iranians and are bothered because neither the Omanis, who eventually were the go-between, nor the US consulted with the Saudis. I think the Saudis also expected much more active role by the US in Syria, and also there is this concern about Iraq too. To everybody's surprise, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain withdrew their ambassadors from Qatar, showing their displeasure of the support that the Qataris give to, among other things, to the Muslim Brotherhood. During his visit to Saudi Arabia, originally the president was supposed to attend the summit of the GCC, but the White House announced that the plan was cancelled. Probably not wanting to witness a divided GCC. To help us understand this and more, we turn to David Ottaway, the senior scholar at the Wilson Center. David is a former Cairo bureau chief of the Washington Post, having spent most of his professional life as a foreign correspondent and national security and investigative reporter for the Post. During his career, he spent 8 years in Africa, 6 in the Middle East and North Africa, and 2 in the former Yugoslavia. He's the author of several books, including most recently The King Messenger, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, and America's Tangled Relationship with Saudi Arabia. And he's the author of a number of occasional papers that he wrote for the Middle East program, including Egypt at the Tipping Point, Saudi Arabia in the Shadow of the Arab Revolt, and Saudi Arabia's Race Against Time. He's currently working on a book regarding the Arab Spring. David, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hala. I wanted to start by giving us all some historical background to this very difficult relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Going all the way back to the oil boycott of 1973, at which time I had just started working at the Washington Post, and they sent me out to cover a guy by the name of Sheikh Yamani, who had come to Washington to issue a warning to the United States that if something was not done about the Palestinian issue, Saudi Arabia was going to lead a boycott, an oil boycott of the United States. And I don't know why, but the Washington Post saw fit to put it on the front page. And it got the attention of Washington, and it began sort of my coverage off and on of U.S.-Saudi relations. Now, my point here is that we've had a number of crises and resets in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. This is not the first time we've come to loggerheads and disputes over various serious issues. And I just want to give you a couple of examples to realize before we get into contemporary issues, some of the crises we've been through before. And to my mind, the worst one before this was just before 9/11 and just afterwards. And I know we've all forgotten what was going on just before 9/11, but the United States Crown Prince Abdullah and the new Bush 43 president were on a collision course because Crown Prince Abdullah felt that the United States was doing, once again, nothing about the Palestinian issue, and even encouraging Ariel Sharon to go in and wipe out the Palestinians and capture Arafat, who was, remember, bunkered down in Ramallah in his headquarters. And in August, August 9/11, I mean, just before 9/11, Abdullah sent I'm going to read some of this because I'm going to come back to it. This is from my book on Prince Bandar and the U.S. tangled relationship with Saudi Arabia. Abdullah sent a 25-page letter to Bush and was furious that Bush was doing nothing, and in fact encouraging, particularly Cheney was encouraging the Israelis to go in and really finish off the Palestinian resistance. Abdullah, this is Bandar's rendition of what Abdullah said to Bush. So there's going to be some flourishing and a sort of exaggeration, but I think the tenor of what he was saying is probably what Abdullah was saying in his letter. So they were really furious about Cheney's comment, encouraging the Israelis to go and wipe out the Palestinian resistance. And he said, in this case, if that's your policy, if President Bush, if it's your policy to allow the crushing of the Palestinian resistance, we have real problems. In that case, quote, in that case, it changes the equation between our two countries. We respect America as a superpower. We respect America to make its decisions as a sovereign nation. And we respectfully disagree with you. This is Crown Prince Abdullah to Bush. Starting from today, as they say, you're from Uruguay, I'm from Uruguay. You go your way, I go my way. This is from a knock-knock, who's there? This is why I say this is Bandar's. I'm sure Abdullah didn't know anything about knock-knocks. From now on, we will, this is Abdullah to Bush. From now on, we will protect our national interests, regardless of where America's interests lie in the region, politically, militarily, and security-wise. We have to get busy rearranging our lives in the Middle East, end of quote. This is me. Abdullah laid down the gauntlet. Either Bush needed to move immediately to put new life into the peace process and ease the Palestinian plight, or Saudi Arabia would freeze its military, political, and security cooperation with the United States. Bandar said he had never carried a message, quote, more plain, more depressing, more painful to the White House. So we were, then of course 9/11 came and overtook this whole issue. But we were really in a tight situation just before 9/11. And this of course continued after 9/11 with the presence of 15 Saudi hijackers among the 19 involved in 9/11. And in fact, we didn't get our relationship back on track until Bush and Abdullah met in Crawford, Texas in April 2005. But in that period after 9/11, we really, I can't remember how many conferences in Washington or around the United States. Saudi Arabia, friend or foe? We were trying to figure out what the Saudi involvement in all this 9/11 was. And on the other hand, the royal family felt they had nothing to do with it, and they were misunderstood, and they were asking themselves, is the United States friend or foe? Now, we got back on track, but before we got back on track, at the end of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March 2003, the Saudis basically kicked us out of our forward operations center at the Sultan base in Saudi Arabia, where we had a very sophisticated operation. But the Saudis had not agreed on our invasion of Iraq, and they did offer us some support, but they were very sore about it, and they wanted to get rid of the American presence on Saudi soil, and they sent us packing. So we have had, real crises and problems in the relationship again and again. Now, one of the key issues has always been the American military presence, should it be in Saudi Arabia or not. And the Saudis always wanted to have us over the horizon and not visible inside the kingdom. But we've had a lot of issues regarding terrorism, the Palestinian peace talks. We've always had a lot of issues. And now we have more. There are both specific issues and there are more general ones. And let's start with the more general ones in the bigger picture that have upset the Saudis and left them wondering where we stand regarding them and regarding the Gulf. 2012, Obama comes out with this idea of a pivot to Asia, which they rebaptize rebalancing of American power away from the Middle East and towards Asia. And this began the Saudis wondering, so were you leaving? Are we leaving the Gulf? Where does that leave us? And they were very upset and uncertain about the U.S. long-term commitment to their security, and particularly their security vis-a-vis Iran. Then you had this is not in, it's not one thing after another, but all these issues came to impinge on their thinking about what is the U.S. relationship towards Saudi Arabia. Then you had the shale oil revolution, and all this talk, we're no longer dependent on the Gulf or the Middle East for oil. And since Saudi Arabia was the main provider of oil to the United States, that of course left them wondering, well, are we still going to have markets, and is there going to be any economic underpinning to our relationship? Then Obama gained this reputation of leading from behind, which left them wondering whether or not the U.S. would ever lead forward rather than behind, and what that meant for them. And then you had the Arab Spring, and the United States abandoning Mubarak and basically telling him to go. And that really upset the Saudis and made them wonder, well, what's your attitude towards the royal family? Finally, just recently, you've had the cut in U.S. military expenditures, cut back in our forces to World War II levels, or even pre-World War II levels. And that has left them wondering, what does this mean for the American posture in the Gulf, Persian/Arab Gulf? So you have all these big issues sort of hanging over or behind the relationship before we get to specific issues that have impinged on the relationship. And I'm going to talk here about Iran, Syria, Iraq, and the Palestinian-Israeli talks. Beginning with the nuclear talks with Iran. The Saudis I think, are much less worried about the nuclear talks than they are about what this means for the relationship for the United States and Saudi Arabia. because they are worried if there is any kind of agreement on nuclear talks, the U.S. and Iran will then try to look for other areas of cooperation. And frankly, they don't know where this leaves Saudi Arabia or the Arab Gulf states. So it's been very unsettling to them to see the United States open this dialogue with Iran, not because they're against limiting, in fact, they're all for it, limiting Iran's nuclear capabilities, but what it means for them in the long run. And then you have Syria, and the Saudis feel they went out on a limb. They were assuming the same thing, the U.S. involvement would be the same as it came to be in Libya. And if you remember, the Saudis had promoted the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, and then gotten the Arab League to back it, and then gotten the United Nations to back it. And all that started with Saudi Arabia pushing for it, because Abdullah had a personal issue with Gaddafi, who had sent a team to try to assassinate him. So he had his own scores to settle that had nothing to do with the Arab Spring. Anyway, when it came to Syria, King Abdullah went way out in front calling for the overthrow of Assad after trying to talk with him and find some way out of a peaceful resolution to the uprising there. He then took the lead of calling for the overthrow of Assad. And, and because Obama was saying Assad has to go, they assumed the Americans would eventually come in and support the rebels and work for the overthrow of Assad. Now, we have not committed ourselves to the overthrow of Assad, and this leaves the Saudis very exposed out on front with no backup from the United States, while the Syrian government has plenty of backup from Russia. So this has really unsettled them. Now, Iraq, I think Iraq is our worst disagreement today. The Obama administration, if you look at it from the Saudi viewpoint, our invasion ended in what Prince Saud, the foreign minister, said, literally, publicly: you've handed Iraq on a silver platter to Iran. And the Saudis have never accepted Nouri al-Maliki's government. They believe he's totally a tool of Iran, Tehran. And we, on the other hand, helped put Maliki in power, ironically, working with the Iranians in parallel, not in a conspiracy, but in parallel, to bring Maliki to power and to keep him there. And we continue our dialogue, and we're helping the Maliki government now with the uprising, the new uprising in Anbar. And we're sending arms to Maliki to help put it down. So we are really in direct conflict in Iraq. I think it's the best or worst example of conflict in our two foreign policies in the region. On the Israeli-Palestinian talks, I think I know the Saudis were delighted to see Obama sending Kerry and what's he gone 9 times now to try and get somewhere and get a resolution of that crisis. I think the Saudis very much appreciate that, the effort that the Obama administration is putting into this. But of course, as things look dimmer and dimmer about what's going to happen, and the unlikelihood of an agreement seems more and more likely, what is the U.S. going to do? Or is the U.S. even going to put, before the talks collapse, enough pressure on Israel to make compromises in order to have an agreement? And if there isn't an agreement, then that issue is going to be another sore between us and Saudi Arabia. So what can Obama do to reassure Abdullah in light of all these problems? They certainly are working, the Obama administration certainly is working hard to reassure the Saudis. I mean, everybody's been talking out. Hagel has been there, made statements of our military commitment, continuing military commitment. So has Kerry, so has Obama. Bill Burns at the State Department has laid out our policy. In other words, we've done verbally, there's been a cascade of reassurances coming from Washington, and a lot of work to prepare the meeting between Obama and Abdullah this Friday and Saturday. But I see a lot of continuing disagreements in the relationship, and I don't think words are sufficient to assure the Saudis of where we're going and whether we're behind them. On Syria, I don't see Obama committing to escalation of American military support to the opposition, at least not sufficient to make a difference on the battlefield, because what the rebels need now are anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank missiles, and despite all the talk, nothing seems to get there in any significant quantity. Now, the only caveat I have there about the U.S. attitude is what influence the Ukraine crisis is having on Obama's thinking about what he should do in Syria, and we can talk more about that later, but maybe there'll be a new calculus in Obama's mind because of that, regarding how much aid and effort to put in supporting the rebels. Iran. I think the problem is larger. I don't think Obama is interested in supporting Sunni Saudi Arabia in its conflict with Shiite Iran for overall influence in the Arab world. I think Obama feels there's no horse in the race for him in that struggle. So we're not behind Saudi Arabia in its quest for more influence and power in the Middle East, and certainly not behind them the way Russia is behind Assad and helping him stay in power. So I don't think the U.S. Obama is going to commit to major military action in Syria, unless, as I said, there's some change in his mind because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. If the talks with Iran, let's go to Iran. If the talks with Iran were to succeed, then I think the Saudis are going to be very nervous and jittery about what that means for them and whether the Americans are going to develop this relationship with Iran and take their, try to create some kind of balance between Iran and not favor either one. Now, there's some interesting developments taking place. There's been talk about Rouhani making a visit to Saudi Arabia. I suspect they're going to talk about this, Obama and Abdullah. And there have been reports that the Saudis have issued an invitation to Rouhani to come. I don't know if it's true. They certainly haven't made it public. But there's a lot of smoke about this possible visit, so there's probably a little bit of fire, too, underneath it all. And the question in my mind is, when would he go? Is this something you reward him for after an agreement? Or do you invite him to come now to help possibly make it more possible, an agreement? That's something I think they're going to be talking about. So the timing of when he might come, I think is, if indeed he's been invited, I think something's going on, is the issue. On Iraq, I don't see any agreement at all between us. We're still committed to Maliki and his government. And the Saudis are on the other side supporting the Sunnis. And as this civil war, to me, it's like a rebirth of the civil war in Iraq between the Sunnis and between Anbar and the central government, i.e. Sunnis against Shia. And the Saudis are going to be on the Sunni side. They've never recognized, they appointed an ambassador, but there's no resident Saudi ambassador in Baghdad, and they will not let Maliki put foot in Saudi soil. I mean, they really are skeptical about Maliki. On the Israeli-Palestinian talks, I'm sure Obama will, push, say, yes, we're doing everything we can, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think Obama can say, yeah, we're really going to squeeze Israel to make the compromises that are probably going to be needed to have any agreement there. And so I don't think he can, there's almost so much he can do to reassure Abdullah about the U.S., how far the U.S. commitment goes. And if they fail, and it falls apart, the negotiations, the U.S. will stand with Israel, as it always has. And this is going to create more tension in the relationship. Now, finally, you have this Qatar-Saudi feud that's just this past week, 10 days since the beginning of March, I guess, come out in the open. And I think that's something that's very disturbing because it shows the Saudis are more in the media concerned about the Brotherhood and their activities than they are about unity of the Gulf Cooperation Council in their confrontation with Iran. And it puts Obama in a very embarrassing situation because we've been working very hard to get the GCC to work together as a military unit, particularly on missile defense. We've been doing this since the GCC was founded in 1981, but it's in the last year, we've really been putting a lot of pressure for the GCC to work as one unit, and this really makes it very difficult. And there's nothing Obama can do to, I don't think, to repair the relationship over the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't think he's going to declare the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, the way the Saudis and the Gulf state, or some of the Gulf states have anyway, and in Egypt also declared them. And so I don't see how he has much to reassure. All our military assets now, because the Saudis kicked us out of Saudi Arabia, are in Doha, in Qatar, Udeid Air Base. So we're certainly not going to, take Saudi side against Qatar when all our main military assets and the forward base of the CENTCOM, Central Command, is there. We're not going to reassure him. Obama's not going to reassure him on that issue. So I think there's just a lot of issues between us that are very difficult to handle and to find common ground on. And so that's why I made the title Mission Impossible, ? For the talk. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David, we'll open the floor to your questions and comments. David, yes, we look forward to your contribution. Would you like to start?
This is His Highness Prince Turki, who joined us.
His Highness Prince Turki is with us. Whenever David speaks on Saudi Arabia, we have the pleasure of welcoming you here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Otway. Thank you for holding this important meeting here. Just observations on I missed the first part of your presentation. I came at the section when you started talking about the U.S. being kicked out of Saudi Arabia after the Iraq war. Just a clarification, the reason for U.S. forces at that time being in Saudi Arabia was to oversee the no-flight zone in the south of Iraq. And having invaded Iraq, the reason ended. And that is why mutual agreement, actually, between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Britain and France, who were equally represented in the no-fly zone at that time, those forces were withdrawn from Saudi Arabia. On Iran, an important issue, of course, definitely King Abdullah, when Rouhani was elected, sent a congratulatory note to Rouhani expressing good wishes and hope for improved relations. Mr. Zarif, Rouhani's foreign minister, has toured the Gulf states except Saudi Arabia. His excuse was that he did not get a firm commitment for a meeting, which, as I understand it, there was a public statement from the kingdom denying that he was not given an appointment. So there is some question mark there as to whether Zarif will or will not, or maybe Rouhani will or will not come. I don't know whether their invitation has been presented to Rouhani yet or not. But he's just been to Oman, and I see the press reporting of talks about his visit to the kingdom. Rouhani is a known personality to the kingdom. When he was head of the Security Council during Khatami's time, he actually was the one who signed the security agreement with Saudi Arabia at that time for mutual efforts against terrorism, etc., and welfare of both states. So he is, as I said, a known personality to the kingdom, and he's made very favorable remarks about Saudi Arabia during the election campaign and after the election campaign, except in the last time he spoke about Saudi Arabia was during the celebration of the so-called Iranian victory over Iraq's invasion in 1982, and President Rouhani blamed Saudi Arabia and the UAE for supporting Iraq during that conflict. So there was one negative remark from him about the kingdom. As far as Egypt is concerned, well, of course, Saudi Arabia and America disagreed on when President Mubarak was ousted, but subsequently, your government has come around to making positive declarations about the roadmap that is in place now to get Egypt back to legitimate government. And there have been, as you know, 2 steps taken by the Egyptians, the constitution and the referendum on that. We're still waiting for the election of the president and the parliament. And I think both countries are pretty much in league, if you like, on maintaining support for achieving those goals of the roadmap for Egypt. On Palestine, you are quite right that we are applauding the efforts of Mr. Kerry very strongly, and hopefully he will get something done. I am skeptical, as you are, about whether Mr. Obama will have the final push to get Mr. Netanyahu to compromise. So it's going to be something to wait and see. On the GCC in general, Saudi Arabia was very much in favor of unity for all GCC countries, as you know, and the King declared that a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, the disagreements with Qatar on not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but there are other things that were mentioned in the statement coming out of 3 countries of the GCC, Bahrain, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, on media coverage, on interference in the affairs of the GCC countries. And I think, and I'm speculating here because I don't have first-hand information, but I think the situation in Bahrain is very important, where Qatar may have been seen to be trying to interfere in Bahrain. And that is one of the reasons why the 3 countries withdrew their ambassadors from Qatar. But as I read in the press, there are efforts by the Kuwaiti Emir to try to overcome these differences. He's been the lead in mediating between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar. And I think during the Arab Summit conference that's going to be held in Kuwait in the next couple of days or so, there are going to be efforts there probably to do that. One of the things that I think are important to keep in mind is that since 1945, basically, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has had its ups and downs. I would say the height of the ups came during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. That's when Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states together were working with the United States to get Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, and succeeded in doing that. So under Bush first, and I think following with Clinton, there was much a common ground between the two countries. Where differences began to occur was under Bush second, over Iraq particularly. Mr. Maliki will remain, I think, a bone of contention between us, and I see no solution to that. They're coming up for elections. The last time the elections were held, as you know, the Iraqi party got plurality. It is headed by a Shiite, Ayad Alawi, but has a larger Sunni complexion to it than Mr. Maliki's party. But because of US pressure and Iranian pressure, Mr. Maliki got to form a coalition and to become the prime minister. Hopefully this time around there will not be that much interference if the elections don't come out too much in favor of Mr. Maliki. He's not popular in Iraq, as you can imagine. And I think this issue of the Anbar is more complicated than it is being presented, particularly in US press, as being Al-Qaeda taking over in Al-Anbar and the Iraqi government trying to push them out. There are Iraqis who say that there's some fabrication to that story, and that Mr. Maliki is trying to use that as a means of gaining more support, especially among the Shia, because he's lost a lot of support even among the Shia, as you well know. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. David will open the floor to, we will just give me a moment. I use the prerogative of the chair to ask David a question. David, why is this concern, fear, that if there is a deal between Iran and the United States, the whole region, the whole region is going to change? There would be a fear of the United States tilting towards Iran, therefore ignoring its allies in the region. There is no ground to it, is there?
Yes, Iraq.
There is. Okay, so go ahead.
Because I think in the Saudi viewpoint, as I said, as Prince Saud said, the U.S., through your invasion, handed Iraq on a silver platter to Iran. And so, from the Saudi viewpoint, they've seen us shift the balance of power to Iran already in one very important instance. So they have every reason to believe the same thing might happen again. We are unpredictable from the Saudi point of view. And if there were an agreement on nuclear issues, I myself can see it as very possible we'll work on other issues. Whether together. Whether or not we'll get anywhere, I don't know. But so the likelihood that there will be some follow-on to a nuclear agreement, and Obama will try to develop more of the relationship with Iran, I think is very possible. And this, they don't know where it's going. We don't either, of course. But they've got to take it into consideration that given what happened in Iraq, that the U.S. could very well try and find and strengthen and expand the relationship with Iran.
David, but the Iranians have made it clear that they only are interested in the nuclear deal, and they are not interested, at least the supreme leader, in political relation or any kind of other. They are even, I mean, Zarif had said that he is not discussing at all the region, precisely. I mean, it's not that the Iranians are sitting there and waiting to jump on this. So that's why my
Well, you
question
know,
is
I mean,
why
the
do
U.S.
you
is saying the
feel-
same thing. You know, we're only talking about the nuclear issue. But Obama says, you know, it's 50-50, you know. So I don't think either side is going to talk about, you know, any kind of cooperation when they don't even know whether they're going to have cooperation on the
Exactly.
nuclear issue. So both sides are saying, no, no, we're only talking about the nuclear issue.
That's, yes, please. Can you wait for the mic, please? Yes. Here and then here. Yes.
Thank you. Benjamin Tua, no affiliation. My question concerns the likelihood or the increasing likelihood of a U.S. policy shift on Syria in light of recent events. You cited the Crimean situation. But there's also the fact that Assad has made clear through the recent Geneva discussions that they have no interest in negotiation and compromise at this point. Subsequently, just I think last week, 10 days ago, the U.S. decided to close the Syrian embassy and its consulates. They did not break off relations, but I suspect that that is in the works and that it's going to come on, and this would be a particularly opportune time for the U.S. to ratchet up its support, even including anti-aircraft types of weapons and so on, especially since Russia is in a very poor position to cite international law as an objection, and getting rid of Assad might benefit not only the U.S. and the West, but Russia and Iran.
You know? It's going to take quite a change in Obama's attitude to do something significant, the way we did in Afghanistan with the Saudis, to chase out the Soviet army. And, you know, we spent billions of dollars together arming the Mujahideen, never put an American boot on Afghan soil, but we armed them very well. We gave them the Stinger missiles. It denied the Soviet Special Forces helicopters to land all across the country because they were being shot down. It made a huge difference. And this option is there to take, but I don't feel Obama he doesn't have the belly for it. He's worried about being sucked into the Syrian conflict to become his war. And he's basically had this policy of dithering. You know, we gave him some aid, then we stopped. We started training the rebels in Amman or in Jordan together with the Saudis. We had a plan, didn't seem to go anywhere, and he keeps going. Obama keeps going back and forth about his administration is divided on this. We've all heard about the divisions. You know, is what's happening in Ukraine going to change his calculation? It's very late in the game for the U.S. to come in now to help the rebels that are very badly divided and fighting each other, et cetera. And I think we'd have to see a different Obama to become, you know, really engaged the way we were in Afghanistan, helping the Mujahideen chase out the Soviets. And I don't see that coming, although, you know, who knows? Maybe we're going to be surprised, but I don't see it coming.
Okay, and we have three questions. Farahnaz Isfahani, Michael Adler, and Mr. Anthony. Okay, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Svandiari. And my question is for David, and if His Royal Highness would like to make a comment, that would be fantastic. We haven't talked at all about really Afghanistan. the United States is pulling out. Maybe we'll leave some troops behind. There hasn't been, again, any willingness to really think this out, whereas countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, India, all of the neighboring countries are now talking to Saudi Arabia, it seems, and to look for a leader on this process, which again is being left behind. So I wanted to find out that is, again, now we've talked about the Middle East, but this US-Saudi kind of divergence is now becoming more than just US Middle East. It's spreading to South Asia, Central Asia, Russia, etc. So the ramifications are of a different world order. So I'd like a take from both David and His Highness on this. Thank you.
Your Highness? The questions are addressed to Saudi Arabia.
You are the man in the there.
David, go ahead.
I'll be happy to answer.
Well, Saudi policy towards Pakistan is very interesting right now because Nawaz Sharif spent, 7 years in Saudi Arabia, and he's kind of their boy coming to power. And Saudi Arabia has just loaned Pakistan $1.5 billion to deal with its economic problems, and I've heard it may be half of what they intend to give over the next year. So the relationship with Pakistan is very close. Now the Pakistanis are playing their own game in Afghanistan. A lot of suspicion they're supporting Taliban. I don't know if there's a wonderful article in the New York Times by Shalata Gall this past weekend about how the Pakistani ISI has all along been supporting the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden knew exactly where he was. They had a special bureau in the ISI taking care of him. Pakistan is going to try and probably move back in and fill the vacuum when the Americans leave. And the Saudi policy, as I see it, is really more on the Pakistani side of thinking things through on what's going to happen in Afghanistan next. While we're trying to, with 10,000 troops or 5,000 troops or whatever number it's going to be, trying to maintain the status quo. That's as you say, there's good reason to believe there could be a big divergence of views between us.
I've been out of the Afghan portfolio for a long time, so what I report to you is what I read in the papers, mostly New York Times and others. But I've always felt that the basic problem in that area is the unresolved issues. You have border issues between Afghanistan and Pakistan that are unresolved. The Durand Line, British colonial legacy. British seem to specialize in leaving legacies behind them on borders. And that, I think, has to be resolved for a normal relationship to develop between Afghanistan and Pakistan. You remember when Pakistan became independent in 1947-48, the only country that did not recognize Pakistan at the time was Afghanistan, because they had at that time ambitions on what was called Pashtunistan. I think issues between India and Pakistan also have an impact on there, because Pakistan, whether justifiably or not, feels that it might be encircled by not too friendly countries like India and Afghanistan and Iran at some time or another. So resolving these issues, I think, was in the hands of the United States once the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2002. But unfortunately, I think the US wasted its effort there by not tackling this issue between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But there is still a chance, and I think the world community can do something there if they promote an economic and financial package for the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan, because it's one of the poorest areas in the world. And if you can get people to think about building schools and hospitals and roads and so on, instead of joining the Taliban or joining some of the other groups that operate out of there or become poppy growers, that will be very helpful. So I think the US inevitably will have to leave Afghanistan. I think even 5,000 or 10,000 soldiers will remain a target as long as they stay there. So there will be an inevitable withdrawal of even such a smaller number of American presence. Before that, the US, I think, should take the lead in providing this economic and financial package to both countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan, to help them overcome the issues there.
Thank you. Michael Adler in the back, please.
Hey, Michael Adler from the Wilson Center. Question for David and for the Prince, if you will. We spoke about Iran, and if there were an agreement, how would Saudi Arabia react? Would they begin to arm themselves with nuclear weapons, perhaps buying them from Pakistan? What is the spirit about how radically they would react to an agreement, or would they become more conciliatory towards Iran? Thank you.
If there were an agreement. Well, you get two viewpoints here. I think the issue is the Saudi Arabia, like Israel, doesn't want to see Iran have the ability to enrich uranium. It's not sufficient just to have no nuclear weapons, but they would much prefer that they didn't have the ability to enrich as well. I don't think that's going to happen. And therefore, Saudi Arabia is going to have to decide whether it is going, it's already pursuing its own nuclear, civilian nuclear program, but to me it seems to be going very slowly. And I've always felt the Saudis' option on this is they have Chinese missiles, and they've spent a lot of effort and time helping Pakistan develop its nuclear program. And the reports are that the Saudis have a new updated Chinese missile that's much more accurate. They have a new missile site. And to me, the Saudis' B plan is to keep that option open if there were an agreement, subjunctive, conditional, that they would keep that option open and start accelerating their own nuclear program, civilian nuclear program, but keep the B option, which is Chinese missiles and Pakistani military nuclear help, there as a fallback.
Yes, please.
John Duke Anthony. David, thank you for the overview and the details. Might you come back to the issue of Iran's involvement, intrusion, support for rhetorical and otherwise for Shia elements in at least 4 of the GCC countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates on one hand, and the view of the GCC countries that this constitutes Iran's intervention in what the GCC countries would believe are essentially Arab affairs, and the omission of allowing some GCC representation, if only as an auditor and being present for the P5+1 discussions with Tehran, in the view that if the EU, Russia, and China had an issue with Canada, that they were trying to negotiate to an agreement. For the United States not to be included in such meetings would be unacceptable and envisioned as impossible. Might you address these two issues and the implications for the relationship between Washington and Saudi Arabia, given the divergence of viewpoint on these issues?
On being included in the P5+1, I think these negotiations are so delicate, so complicated, that the U.S. attitude is we don't want anybody else involved. It's complicated enough as it is. And they are talking to the Saudis about what's happening. It's not like they're keeping them in the dark. But they just don't want to start including other people or other countries in the negotiations because they are already so complicated and so 50-50. On the Iranian attitude towards their Shiite minorities in the Gulf states, yes, they have been supporting them. And my feeling I think this could change. There have been some secret negotiations over the 3 United Arab Emirates islands, although both sides are denying it. But the detail that has surfaced about those negotiations suggests that something is going on. And so Rouhani and the Iranians, or Iran under Rouhani, could change, it's possible, particularly if there's an agreement on the nuclear issue, could start changing their attitude about, inciting the Shia in Bahrain, and how they deal with the Shia in the other Gulf states, were there to be an agreement. And I think it's very intriguing, very interesting. And when we saw that report, I took it into about the 3 islands in the Gulf. To me, this was astounding that Iran was holding secret talks about some resolution of the 3 islands. But if it's true,
They denied it.
well, everybody's denied it. Everybody's denied it, but there's a lot of detail about how they would share sovereignty and the use of the islands. To me, it was just too much detail to be a fantasy, somebody, dreaming it up. So hopefully there's an agreement and Rouhani comes to Saudi Arabia, and then I think things will come down on this issue.
We are going to take one last question, but very brief question. Yes, please. Can you wait for them? But really brief because we have run out of time. Thank you.
I'll be very brief if you are. Emil Baroud, I'm with Al Mayadeen Network. We had a review of the U.S.-Saudi relations, but in fact, what is President Obama going to do? How would he go about warming the relations? Your input, Your Highness, would also be welcome.
Okay.
Well, I've said they're going to reassure about the American military commitment to the Gulf and the Gulf states. And actually, I don't think that's the issue. I think it's these policy issues over Syria and Iraq, and I don't think Obama can reassure him on those issues. I don't think anything is going. It's going to remain very, let's say fragile, because I think the U.S. commitment to Saudi Arabia, were Saudi Arabia to be attacked by Iran, the U.S. will be there in a minute. So, for the big insurance policy, we're still there. But on these regional issues, we're not. And it's that tension between, we're selling the Saudis, $58 billion worth of arms. Our military relationship is quite close, as is our cooperation on counter-terrorism issues. It's instantaneous. We have what's called a fusion center, where the two governments change information immediately about terrorism, who's going where, who's a threat, et cetera. So in those areas, on the big issues, terrorism, counterterrorism, and overall security, Saudi security in case they're attacked, I think the relationship is pretty good. But there are all these other issues that are impinging and affecting the atmosphere. And quite frankly, I don't see how Obama can sort of dissipate all these doubts and uncertainties that the Saudis share with regard to the United States and what it's going to do. I mean, how can you be sure what the U.S. is going to do when there was a red line about chemicals in Syria and like that, he changed and, we're going to do something else. Russia came in and sort of saved his bacon, or that's the wrong word in the Arab world, but huh?
Beef bacon.
Beef bacon.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. Please join me in thanking him. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Your Highness, for contributing. Next time, we'll invite you to come and sit at the head of the table. After the David, thanks so much.